In this lesson, we talk about diffuse samples. Diffuse samples are actual GI bounce light, how the light interact within our scene. Without GI samples or GI diffuse samples, you might say, we only see the effect of the direct lighting. So when diffuse sample value is bigger than 0, camera rays hitting a diffuse surface fire indirect diffuse rays in random direction within a hemispherical spread. So if you take a look at this picture from Arnold's support page, here it is. As you can see, a camera ray is fired. When this ray hits a surface, indirect diffuse rays will be generated. As you increase your diffuse samples, you are increasing the number of indirect diffuse rays fired from those hit points, and by doing so, reducing indirect diffuse noise and getting a higher quality GI bounce. Now let's go over this concept quickly. The same scene we worked with in our previous lesson with some minor adjustments. This is the render that we are getting by default. Let's open our render setting here. As you can see, we have 3 camera samples and 2 samples for diffuse, glossy, and refraction rays. Now let me decrease my camera glossy and refraction rays to 1 and reduce subsurface scattering or SSS and volume samples to 0 because we don't have any subsurface scattering or volumetric in our scene. If I enable my IPR, we are gonna have this noisy render. Okay, you can see here. Now let me zero out my diffuse samples, and as you can see, by looking at the IPR, we no longer see any indirect lighting or GI. We can see dark areas underneath the objects here. Now we only can see the effect of direct lighting right now. As soon as you have a bigger value than 0, like for example 1 in your diffuse sample, you start to see the indirect lighting and the effect of GI. Now what we have is physically correct, and our only concern is how to improve the quality and reduce the indirect diffuse noises. We can do so by increasing the number of our diffuse samples. Now remember, it is possible to increase the diffuse sampling quality by increasing the camera samples, but that would affect everything else too in the scene. So if we made sure the origin of the noise is GI diffuse, it is only logical that we increase the number of our diffuse samples without affecting any other thing in the scene. So when we increase the number of our diffuse samples, we are increasing the quality of our GI diffuse without increasing or decreasing or affecting the quality of other parts and other ray types. Now let me increase the diffuse sample from 1 to 6, and if I render this scene to my picture viewer, the results would be like this. Now let me go here to my picture viewer. If you look closely here, even though the render is very noisy, the areas affected by the indirect rays are much cleaner. If you take a look at these areas underneath this object is much cleaner, and if you compare it to the previous render when we had 1 diffuse sample, as you can see, much cleaner these areas underneath the object. And finally, let's increase our camera and diffuse samples to about 4, and this is going to be the result of a render with these settings. We still have some noise in some parts of our render, but they are definitely not caused by GI diffuse samples. And the reason for the current noise are the low values of direct light samples. So let's increase the sample of these 2 light that we have in the scene to about 4. Let me just do it, and there we go. And we're gonna have this clean noise-free render if we render our scene with the current setting that we have. Now 2 things to remember though. First of all, remember the actual number of diffuse samples are the input squared multiplied by camera samples squared. So And also use diffuse samples sparingly because it's gonna have a huge impact on your render time. For example, if you saw some GI diffuse noise, increase this value to 2 and see if the noise is gone. If still there were some GI noise, then increase it to 3, and here I think you get what I'm saying here. So in this lesson we discussed diffuse samples, and hopefully in the next lesson we're going to talk about glossy samples, and after that there would be refraction samples, and then we can discuss ray depth. And after we discuss these kind of very core principles, I know they're boring, but they're essential. After we discuss this, we're going to start talking about different light type, how to light your scene, how to make great shaders, and those cool stuff are going to come. So just bear with me, go through this concept, make sure you understand them perfectly. So we're going to have no problem going through a more, great subjects like lighting and shading in our next lesson. So see you there.